Good evening and welcome. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This program focuses on interactive debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans, and certainly looking, examining and unpacking some of the global dominant trends in the international community and what it means for us as South Africans. When it became clear last week that the ANC was not going to suffer the kind of massive drop in support that they feared was on the cards, Jesse Duarte, Deputy Secretary General, Fikile Mbalula, campaign chief, and a whole coterie of party leaders at the Results Centre in Pretoria walked around grinning and laughing like a bunch of Cheshire cats. Well, here's the question. Did they dodge an electoral bullet? And will the electoral largesse of the ANC last forever? Well, debating that for the first time now, post-election, I'm joined in the studio by Rassool Snyman, who is founder of the anti-treason movement, a well-known community activist in the Greater Durban area, and also joining us as a last-time Professor George Devenish, a Professor Emeritus at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and an expert in constitutional law. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let me start off with you, Professor. From what we can see, and certainly looking at the results, the 2019 national election results, the aggregate of 57.51% represented the lowest level of support that the ANC has ever secured. From what you can gather, and certainly disappointing to a large number of South Africans, does the party slide seem inexorable in the near future, come 2024, then 2028?
Well, it's going to really depend on one man, essentially, and that's the new president. If the president is able to display inspired leadership and using that inspired leadership to tackle the fundamental problems of the country, which are both political and economic, if he can put an end to the endemic corruption, if he can bring about far better service delivery, if he can effect meaningful reconciliation within his own party, and if he is able to govern the country in accordance with the letter and spirit of the Constitution and bring the people together, then he will be successful for South Africa.
In other words, Professor, what you're saying is that as it stands, the ANC seems to be in deep trouble, and a lot of the cutting criticism has been reserved for the ineptitude of the DA to capitalize on, for example, the whole issue of state capture, grand corruption. President Cyril Ramaphosa would have to force his party, in effect, to engage in some sort of navel gazing, in a manner of speaking, this internal analysis in terms of what has gone wrong. And I'm not so sure if he's a man really up for the particular position.
Well, first of all, as far as Ramaphosa is concerned, I've indicated on these programs before that I worked personally at CODESA with Ramaphosa. He was known as one of the troubleshooters with Mac Maharaj, Fani van der Merwe, and he displayed very great leadership and political acumen in 1993 in bringing together the many committees that had to reach a consensus on very controversial issues. And this was done essentially through his expertise, his character, and everything came together at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of December 1993. And he did a similar job in the Constitutional Assembly. So although I didn't know him personally and know him well, I did see him as a competent, effective, and also an honest broker.
With some sort of, so you describe him as an honest broker with some sort of political acumen. Rassool, let me just bring you in on that point. And we're going to unpack the whole notion of even the man Ramaphosa. We always talk again and again about the will of the electorate, and certainly a large disappointment by a large number of people that the ANC is still in power. But the flip side of the coin is that some analysts are arguing that the party was to a large extent punished for state capture, or alternatively, some people hypothecate that this is as a result of the gradual decline that set in post-2004. Would you see that as symptomatic of ongoing trends in terms of how the ANC is viewed in the public? Because they still have an insurmountable large support base.
Yusuf, for me, we have to look at not only the mechanics of party politics, but the framework of party politics in itself. We have to look at the system of party politics. For example, we talk about democracy, but we haven't as yet spoken about the different forms of democracy. I'll go back to the point that the ANC, when it came into power, and Professor Devenish is aware of that, there was talks of a second revolution. Whilst we inherited the parliamentary process, there was talks of a second revolution where we would restructure politics.
Post-1994.
Post-1994. And when one looks at even the Westminster model, for example, it's actually elitist in nature.
Well, that's the system that we've effectively inherited. And the ANC has certainly bought and continued that trajectory.
Well, in the struggle narrative, the idea was that we'd look at everything and reinvent it. We'd reconfigure it. We'd turn it into a true democracy that reflected the people and at the same time served the needs of the people, not served the needs of an elite. The argument even prior, for example, the ANC, earlier in its trajectory, when it was still younger, and Nelson Mandela and Robert Sobukwe were still in the Youth League, they challenged the ANC because of the fact that the ANC did not want independence or liberation in the true sense of the word. It wanted to share dominance.
So basically, just to unpack that, when we talk about, I mean, what would the defining parameters of a second revolution be? I mean, what would that entail? Are we talking about some degree of bloodletting? Are we talking about a total overhaul and collapse of the existing systems? What are the kind of, if you're going to zero in, you talk about a second revolution, it's very arbitrary by its nature. What are the kind of key factors that would constitute?
One would have to look at how to restructure the system, because if one looks at, for example,
which is doing away with the whole parliamentary system?
Not necessarily. It could be a phased approach. It could be, for one, one could look at the system and say, is it functioning? One could analyze the system, is it working? And then say, who is it working for? Is it addressing the needs of the people, or is it addressing the needs of an oligarchy that's sitting out there and plundering the state? Now, we haven't had a chance post-1994 to sit down as a nation and say, where do we go to now? This was the dialogue that was supposed to happen. We were supposed to pull in the academics, we were supposed to pull in the legal people, we were supposed to
And that never happened.
It never happened because there was a
but there
promise
was,
of it.
to a certain extent, some degree of advice from the right, from the center right. If you look at some of the economic models that were adopted by the ANC, I mean, even post-1994, there were criticisms that the policies were by and large Thatcherite. In terms of the economic policies adopted by the ANC, in terms of what Nelson Mandela for him, for example, he spoke about the whole issue of nationalization, and then post-1994 an about turn of privatization is a way to go in all industries.
Well, that was again, as the anti-treason movement, we don't believe that foreign aid is foreign aid. We believe foreign aid is a guise for treason, because one has to look at what does a republic do? Who does the republic serve? Whose interests does it serve? For example, the utilities company should be serving the interests of the nation.
Yes.
If the utilities company is taken and sold to a foreign person who benefits from the soul and blood of the nation, is that not within the parameters of treason?
Absolutely. And there's certainly questions can be laid, and certainly we could look at it from a legal perspective, but I just want to focus on that. It's a general given. South Africa's economy is struggling, has been struggling for a number of years. Ramaphosa has promised to tackle current challenges, and certainly from your assessment of the man in 1993, in the early 90s, you saw him as someone with some degree of political acumen. The reality of the situation is that for the decade during the Zuma administration, even as a deputy president, there was inevitably a large amount of inertia on his part in either not doing anything, not speaking out against anything that was happening. I mean, surely he would have known about the fact that almost every single government department within the then Zuma administration, one could argue even now, was infested with grotesque levels of corruption, never spoke out against it. And post 2019, post 8th of May, we were just having a discussion. If you look at some of the appointments, well, certainly the proposed list of cabinet members, you've got the usual suspects, Batabile Dlamini, Malusi Gigaba, Nomvula Mokanyane. I mean, individuals with rather tainted backgrounds. I'm asking the question, is this just simply not, you know, as people would describe Reagan, what they would call a Teflon president?
Well, you know, I mean, my own view of that is the following, that Ramaphosa was biding his time. It was a political judgment he made. If he had taken an aggressive approach to President Zuma, he would have been booted out. He took a decision.
Would he have not maintained or retained his respectability and his principles?
Well, I think he took the decision that he had to keep his head below the parapet because he was aiming for the top job. And he realized that if he remained in the position of deputy president, didn't antagonize too many people, then he would have a very good chance of becoming the president. So he opted.
Was he biding his time, in other words?
He was biding his time.
And ambitious at the same time.
He kept his head below the parapet, and when the opportunity came, it was a risk. All politics involved a risk, and he took that risk with everything it involved, and then ultimately he got the top job. And he now is in a position to actually put the things right.
So someone that's expedient, and are you saying we need to give him the benefit of time?
Well, I think from my point of view, that was one of the ways in which to go. If he had openly rebelled against Zuma, he felt that he would have no prospect of being president. So he made a judgment, you see.
A judgment call.
It was a judgment call,
well,
rightly or wrongly, and there may be moral reservations about that. Why did he not speak out against injustice? Surely he had a moral and political, he did so. You see, he took that judgment to remain quiet, and now he's emerged as the president.
And before we go for the break, the list of members who people would have expected to have no longer been part of the National Assembly, those individuals still find themselves there. The argument put forth back then was that he was waiting his time till the upcoming elections and not wanting to antagonize or cause inherent divisions. But what's the excuse now?
Well, it's more or less the same, that he is still dealing
with deep divisions within his own party.
Yes, with deep divisions and very difficult people. And once again, I would give him the benefit of the doubt. Ramaphosa is a clever politician. He does not move in an irrational way or in an impetuous way. He moves slowly and he tries to take his own constituency with him. In so doing, he has actually weakened the opposition within the ANC, and there is now this powerful Ramaphosa factor that Ramaphosa is far more popular than the ANC. And this has strengthened his hand within the party.
Well, we're going to look at the implications of that, because you made some telling thoughts there. We just have to go for a quick ad break, as I've been noticed, and we'll be back shortly to continue the discussion. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ, and if you just joined us, we are involved in a post-election discussion of what happened on the 8th of May. And with me in the studios, I've got two esteemed gentlemen, Rassool Snyman, founder of the anti-treason movement, well-known community activist and rebel-rouser, and Professor George Devenish, well-known academic, Professor Emeritus at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Rassool, coming back to the issue, this man, as Professor stated, a man who was waiting to buy out his time, extremely astute or expedient politician, a man who knows the gift of the games, and effectively creating a powerful Ramaphosa faction as opposed to support for the ANC. Is this not someone that is riding his high horse and effectively opening up a new way, a new demagogue on the horizon?
You've just made me smile, Yusuf. Firstly, it's a good captain on a pirate ship. They're out to commit piracy. Now, whether he's
him particularly is the same. Would you say him representing the pirate,
well,
the captain may not necessarily be as rotten as a pirate ship?
Whether you have a smart captain or you have a dumb captain, the end result is piracy. So that is where we stand as far as the politics of the ANC are concerned. The ANC, as you rightly pointed out, by the appointment of the cabinet members, means it's still on track. The captain could change. The first mate could aspire to be captain, but the piracy continues.
One could argue the level of skullduggery would not be as amplified on the same level as within the Zuma administration.
No, it would be smoother. In fact, it
more sophisticated.
It would be more sophisticated, for example, and it's like your robber giving you a glass of wine after he's taken your fortune. What we have to look at is, again, I'm looking at the vehicle, the state vehicle. What is the state? What is the republic? Who is the republic supposed to serve? How does it serve the people? If it is not serving the people, is this republic still a republic? Are we still on the ship of the people, or are we now on the ship of pirates and at the we in the gallows, we the people? Now, when we look at the concept of the republic is supposed to serve the people. The republic is supposed to have servants every 5 years who bring the greater good to the people. If the greater good is not being brought to the people, then we have a problem.
Which hasn't been done for the past decade.
It hasn't been done.
The argument is that it will be done. That's the point.
It's 25 years later, quarter of a century. I don't think we have the time and the luxury
to wait another 5 years.
To have faith in people. No more. Democracy is not based on faith. Democracy is based on questions and doubts. That's why you have a constitution to rein people in, not to give them a free rein. If one looks at our hospitals, for example, go to King Edward. It's like being in Dante's seventh circle of hell.
The queues now on one of the public hospitals are infinitesimally long.
Now,
healthcare.
Yusuf, I work in communities. I've seen children die. I've seen mothers die. I've seen youngsters die. I've seen rapes in the communities. I've seen robbery in the communities. That happens because there is no service delivery and because the economy, for example, is not where it should be. For example, we spoke about the struggle And the struggle spoke about the economy being put in the hands of the people for the benefit of the people. If we inherit an oligarchy that plunders the state, it's not an innocent act. If someone stole my cell phone, it has ramifications in terms of I wouldn't be able to call. But when someone plunders the coffers of the state, someone dies somewhere because there's no medicine, for example. Now, who comes and gives that?
The culpability, the responsibility.
Exactly. It's a grave thing that's being done, and we treat it too lightly because it's been normalized and culturalized that we accept corruption as something minor, but it's not minor. In China, they hang the politicians. You know, because it's grave. I mean, we started the anti-treason movement on the basis that it's a crime against the people and a crime that results in death and poverty. If, for example, you live in a shack, if you live in a shack, you get what is called the poor man's disease. That's TB. Everyone has TB, and people are dying of it.
Probably one of the highest in the world, in South Africa.
Who holds the politician that plunders the coffers responsible? Cyril Ramaphosa, I beg to differ with Professor Devenish on his integrity. He was responsible for MTN moving millions, if not billions, offshore. He and his party are responsible for allowing companies to move money offshore without any taxation, tax-free.
I mean, that's the whole point, because for Africa alone, as much as about 30% of private wealth is or may be held offshore, and you're denying African governments, if you took looking at it in dollars, approximately $15 billion in tax revenues. South Africa is no different. I mean, there are armies of tax advisors, multinational companies. They exploit loopholes in the tax codes to effectively the shift profits to tax havens at the full support of the governments, and South African government no different.
Well, that has been the argument, and it comes down to one question: who does the government serve? I mean, at the end of the day, Professor Devenish may agree with me, there is what we call the state, and below is the government. The government is not the state.
Yes.
The government is an arm of the state, a manifestation of the state.
And that's the conundrum that people make. The government is not the state itself.
Well, what we do, there was a silent coup in 1994, where the ANC, using our trust on them, we trusted them as a liberation movement. What they did, they committed a coup. What they did, they convinced us, the people, that they were the state, which meant they could do anything they wanted,
which
with
they've
whoever
done for
they
25
wanted.
years.
Yes, and we felt that we're powerless to challenge them. But in direct democracy, the people should have rights and powers. For example, if we feel that Parliament is not serving us, we should have the right to dissolve it as the people. If we want to call a referendum, for example, we don't have the powers to call a referendum. Government calls the referendum. It's like the wolves calling a referendum for the sheep.
It's a phenomenal analogy.
You know, and this is where the common voter has been bamboozled, as Malcolm X would say.
Kind of ostracized from the actual political process, the process of political participation.
It's
with the exception, of course, of just simply putting a cross next to a box.
The ANC is brilliant in magic acts. It's tantamount to David Copperfield.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting analogy, Professor. I need to bring you into this, because if, as Rassool says, and I'm not so sure if you agree, that there was indeed a coup in 1994, and that by and large, to a large extent, the situation in South Africa has not been extremely positive these past 25 years, despite the political spin and rhetoric that comes out from the mouths of politicians. There's been degradation, there's been an amplification of poverty, amplification of crime, almost every department rampant with corruption. The problem that I have is that despite all this, despite the recognition by the masses, and we've seen this in Durban, and possibly sometime next week a talk about bringing Durban to a standstill, despite all of that, despite all the dissatisfaction, the ANC, as it stands, doesn't seem to face any kind of significant challenge to its power. I mean, people talk about the next 5 years being a test. The past 5 years were a test. The past 5 years showed how down the ANC could go. It seems they simply won. I mean, if you look at the facts, the EFF They tried to capitalize on the public disillusionment of the ANC. They failed. They managed something like 10% of the vote. The Democratic Alliance, which was the main opposition party, they won more than 20% of the vote. They won approximately 20%, but that was a decrease from 2014. So despite the situation being dire, it seems that it's business as usual.
I must differ from my good friend here, but that's because I am really an inveterate optimist, as I've often said.
Perhaps too optimistic?
Perhaps. Because I believe, in spite of the ANC government, we have made a remarkable transformation from apartheid to democracy. And you must remember that democracy anywhere in the world is never a perfect solution. It's always very messy. If you go and look at the UK, there are huge problems over Brexit. If you go to the United States at present, there's great dissatisfaction with Trump. But what I can say, and I am 77 years of age, that we still have made a most remarkable transformation from the obscenely unjust system of apartheid and imperialism and colonialism that preceded it. We have a Bill of Rights. People use the courts in order to secure their rights.
The individual rights.
Individual rights, also groups will use it.
Collective rights?
Yes, collectively people will use the courts if necessary. And one aspect of this democracy that has worked very well is the judicial system. And through the judiciary,
the independence of the judiciary.
We've had some very remarkable judgments. And I am pleased to say that as a South African, I feel that I can walk tall with my fellow citizens, that I value them as equals, regardless of their culture and their religion, that the democracy has brought us, for instance, freedom of expression and many other rights. Where we have failed greatly is in relation to the socio-economic rights, and we have failed abysmally to bring about equality in relation to the economy. That's been a fundamental failure, is the economic inequality, and that is largely the fault of the ANC. With the civil and political rights, we have, in my view, made great progress. Also in relation to the issue of human dignity and how our human dignity is protected, in many respects, not perfectly, we have made strides. So I do not see the 25 years of democracy as a failure. I see that we have made progress, but it's work in process, and we have a long way to go. And unfortunately, during the last 9 years, we have gone backwards.
Retrogressively backward.
Yes.
Rassool, I mean, would you agree with that, that it hasn't been all doom and gloom? And what I think Professor is mentioning is that you're looking at individual rights, you're looking at, for example, the expression, the non-discriminatory aspects of the legislation itself. From that angle, one could argue somewhat of an egalitarian society, but obviously the downside is that the socio-economic inequality doesn't complement what you have codified in principle.
I think, yes, there have been gains, but a lot of the gains are theoretical gains. For example, when we say dignity, I don't see dignity in poverty. I don't see it, because if you haven't addressed the inequalities of the economy, You cannot address poverty.
I'm just going to stop you there on that point, Rassool. We're going to come back and continue that particular issue. So just hold that thought and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ, and I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail. If you just joined us, we're having an interesting discussion and conversation on what faces South Africans post 8th of May, with the ANC once again winning these elections. Rassool, just having interrupted you on that particular point, and I think the point you're articulating is that dignity and the rights of the human being and the individual cannot be viewed in isolation at a theoretical level without obviously some sort of practical representation in terms of the socio-economic equality on the ground, which the reality hasn't obviously played out.
When we look at, for example, the shack cities, I work amongst them. And what I see there is not democracy. I know a young girl, for example, who's 26 years old and doesn't know what freedom means in the true sense of the word. If we look at, for example, our liberation struggle, we've got to say, what was it about?
What was it about?
If
the principles of the Freedom Charter?
It was the commodification of a people and them being turned into mere cheap labor to advance the cause of the elite who ate high on the hog, so to speak. Now, society is still fractured along those lines. Our poverty has deepened. It's gotten worse. Our shack settlements have now become shack cities. For example, our hospitals have gotten worse. Our educational system is failing.
Those who are still arguing that this is all as a result of the legacy of apartheid, that argument is becoming more and more shallow by the day.
I don't, it's a truism to a large extent, because apartheid never ended.
The economic apartheid
Economic
continued.
apartheid never ended. We may have had the legal apartheid stopped, which Professor Devenish has alluded to, and I agree with him. But when we look at the economic apartheid, it never stopped. It never stopped, it continued. All that happened is the apartheid elite was joined by the new black elite.
Why when they had the opportunity?
Again,
Were they co-opted? Was it a question of pressure placed upon the leadership? Was it fear? Was it a lack of understanding of ideologies? I mean, a lot of these individuals who were in prison were not probably aware of the makings of a state, how to run a state.
Yusuf, one can only juxtapose this against what they call the neo-colonial state. A true liberated state would take the people and place them at the center, because the people are the state. But when it takes the people and place them on the periphery and takes companies, for example, and place them in a position of centrality, then that is not the state. It's not a people state. It's not a republic.
I mean, the irony of what you pointed out, I was just looking at the business report 2 days ago, the meeting that Cyril Ramaphosa had with the Africa representative of Goldman Sachs. And accompanying the article was the talk of, again, investment into the country, leading to the creation of jobs, the usual rhetoric, but at the end of the day, still a maximization of profit for a limited few, and the talk of creation of jobs, job opportunities, very arbitrary and peripheral.
Well, Yusuf, the argument from my point is that when we say we want to create jobs, under apartheid we had jobs, we were cheap labor. So if we continue the mantra of jobs, when are we going to talk about economic ownership?
Who creates jobs? It's
Yes,
small business. It's a small business owners, not government, right?
When do we look at the ownership of the economy? Now, we go back to the ANC and its cadre deployment and the fact that it cannot find its way out of this maze, not because it does not have the capacity, but because it does not have the will and it does not have the vision. I'm a business consultant, for example, I take people and I do business plans, and when we take them to the financial institutions, we find a cadre sitting behind there who cannot fathom a business plan, for example, but he's placed there because he gathers votes. Now, the ANC is sacrificing the republic for the party. Now, when any entity, if my business...
Is this just simply naive on its part?
No,
or
it's
is
not.
it
It's
deliberate?
a calculated move. Why is it calculated? When we look at 1994 was a merger between the new elites and the old elites. I mean, wasn't there an integration between the apartheid regime and the new apartheid regime?
Are you saying that's what happened at CODESA?
That's what happened in CODESA. It may have been done in good faith. It may have been done in good faith. But one has to look at the shenanigans that happened before, which was the talks before talks.
We've had this discussion, Professor, about the so-called political compromise of 1990, 1991, 1992. I just saw a report. I'm not so sure if it discusses the well-known journalist Naomi Klein in her book The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and obviously looking at some statistics which she calculates on the rand dollar basis. This is her stats as given in 2007, long before the Zuma administration. This is what she says. Since 1994, the year the ANC took power, the number of people living on less than $1 a day, or just to translate into rands, has doubled from 2 million to 4 million in 2006. Between 91 and 2002, unemployment rate doubled from 23% to 48%. The ANC government has built, according to its claims, 1 million homes, but more than 2 million people have lost their homes. Close to 1 million people have been evicted from farms in the first decade of democracy. In 2006, more than 1 in 4 South Africans live in shacks, and the figures now are more amplified in 2019. More than half South Africans, about 55.5%, live below the national poverty line of 992 rands per month. Looking at these figures, and I was having a discussion with anti-apartheid stalwart Ben Turok, and he took significant offense to it, but looking at these stats, the stats, shockingly, are even worse than the economic position and condition during the heights of apartheid.
If I may comment on stats, Winston Churchill said there were liars, there were damned liars, and then there were statistics. Look, unfortunately, we have not made the progress we should have made. And our fundamental difficulty at present is the economic inequality. And my argument is that if in the last 10 years we had inspired political leadership that had tackled the problems of inequality in relation to land and other resources, we could have made far greater progress. I think there are 22 million African people who are living in dire poverty. There are, I think, 8 million people unemployed.
Do we have, some are arguing is that the status quo is continuing because we do not have an effective and credible political opposition. One example, the Democratic Alliance, the EFF, looking at the Democratic Alliance, it has, or certainly within certain circles, still has the image of attracting liberal white voters, although it's got Mmusi Maimane as its particular leader, internal squabbles within transformation. The EFF talks about the entire fascist nature of the EFF and the fact that these are effectively, as some would say, revolutionaries or so-called revolutionaries living in luxurious houses and driving Aston Martins. The reality is that the opposition hasn't provided any kind of meaningful, credible opposition to the ANC which could galvanize the mass of South Africans to say, look, here's an alternative way forward. We are fed up with what we've received. We are fed up with the degradation, the poverty, the crime, the failings of various departments within government. This is a credible opposition we are looking. We don't have that, do we?
Well, I don't think you can blame all the problems that the country faces on the fact that you consider the opposition to lack credibility. The difficulties of the country, as my colleague has pointed out, lie at the door essentially of the ANC. You know, we cannot say, well, it's the fault of not having a credible opposition. That is an argument that I reject entirely. The state of the country, the lack of economic equality, is the result of corruption within the ANC, that the ANC hasn't lived up to the great ideals of the Freedom Front, of the Freedom Charter. There is where the fault must lie. And that what I am saying is that if you had inspired political leadership within the ANC, and that can still come, and my own view is that Ramaphosa has the opportunity to provide that. But I still continue to say that doesn't mean that democracy has failed entirely. I believe that democracy continues to work in South Africa, however messy it has been, even if it has been not entirely successful, and that we need to continue on the democratic path, and that our constitution, although most certainly not perfect, is a workable one that can deliver results. And the judiciary has risen to the occasion.
Did you see the political landscape being influenced and changed somewhat by now certainly the emergence of the far left, as some would argue superficially, the EFF, and also the far right with the Freedom Front, or slip of the tongue, mentioning the Freedom Front, I think galvanized something like probably 10 seats in Parliament. Does there seem to be a slight shift in the political landscape indicating that, albeit at a very slow camel-paced level, dissatisfaction?
Oh, I think not a little dissatisfaction.
Significant
I
amount.
think very considerable dissatisfaction, and that the considerable vote that the EFF has obtained indicates their intense dissatisfaction with actually not only the government, but the system itself. It's a warning sign to South Africa.
But
the warning bells are ringing.
But that's a danger, because we've had this discussion before in respect of the EFF and the political makeup of this creature. Although arbitrarily may seem to evoke the slogans of the left, by its very nature, some have argued, fulfills all the requirements of fascism.
Well, I agree with that. I think to a large extent the EFF is a fascist grouping, and their tactics are fascist. It's also combined with an element of Marxist politics, because they have indicated that they want a centralized economy, at least in relation to land. They want the state to own all the land, and then the state will let it out.
Rassool, a quick point on that before we have to go for an ad break, but a quick point on that in response to Professor.
I think we've mentioned a number of things. One thing that we talk about, the land issue and the EFF. If the EFF centralizes land, for example, then it gets to plunder land. We cannot address the land question.
And the same with BLF, Black First, Land First. The same.
Again, Professor Devenish has just mentioned it's the system as a whole. So I don't think changing one cog or another is going to change the system as a whole. When we look at, Professor Devenish has indicated that we lack leadership. I'm going to argue that we lack leadership with a vision, because it depends on where you're leading us to, not just that you're a good leader.
Just stop on that point, Rassool. I'm going to come back to you, but I'm just been motioned that I have to go for a quick ad break to pay our bills, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our final segment of our Beg to Differ. And if you've just joined us, we have been having an interesting discussion on the implications and consequences of the ANC's win on the 8th of May, and certainly what that means for us as South Africans. Rassool, just to having stopped you on that point, and the issue of, which you made quite interesting enough, that this call for nationalization of all land, in many respects is, as you correctly pointed out, just simply another stepping stone for those separate alternative elite to engage in plunder and looting at the expense of the masses.
We have been, I'm going back to the point of the second revolution. We trusted the ANC. We trusted it to serve the people. And it hasn't served the people, it has served itself. For me, it's like being, again, I'm going to use the analogy of the pirate ship. It's like being a slave on the pirate ship. And there's an argument between the captains and the first mate and who should lead the ship or who should steer it, but it's still going to plunder. The idea of the liberation struggle was to change the nature of the ship and release the captives at the bottom.
Well, what should Ramaphosa do?
Well, the first thing
If
that
he proves
happens...
himself to be, well, the ultimate president.
The question, it's the wrong question, Yusuf. It's what should we, the people, do? Not Ramaphosa. That's just another captain on the same ship, heading in the same direction out to plunder.
Will he not change?
I don't think so. For me, he has been part of the creation of the ANC.
Very much epitomized what the ANC has represented over the past 25 years.
If we look at, for example, the neoliberalism, for example, it didn't start today, it started then. Our water does not belong to us, for example. Now we're having a bargain basement sale where we're selling off all state resources. If we sell off state resources, who is the state? Who benefits? All we are customers in a republic. That's not of our own ownership.
Don't have access or ownership to anything.
We don't own it.
Resources, land, water, nothing.
We don't. Land was one of the primary reasons why we fought the liberation struggle. Land. If the land question has not been addressed, then there's no freedom.
But the fact that these parties again are purportedly addressing the land, what's the danger there?
The land issue is a band-aid. It's not a solution. All we're doing is we're shifting around the problem, but not dealing with it. Land comes with three components generally. The one component is land ownership. The second is productive values. The third is the minerals and water and so on and so forth. And we should not conflate the three. Let's say, for example, in a perfect system, for me as a socialist, I'm a socialist, unapologetically. In a perfect system, the state would own the land. Why would it own the land? It would own the land to save it from the bankers, number one, because the bankers take your land in private property. They give you loans. They
basically are the
generally
actual owners. When the property is bonded, it actually belongs to the bank or the financial institution.
Then, if we look at the productive values, everybody should have equal access to the productive values. Whether you're a white farmer, a black farmer, yellow farmer, miner, everyone should have at least access to that equally.
The
without
means of production
discrimination.
should be equitably distributed.
Yes, but
is there enough?
there's more than enough. I think a survey was done, and it was said if we take the monies that this country has, or the wealth, we'd have 5 million each. Every citizen here would have money, and we generate money. And I think we're not deploying our resources correctly. For example, if we began to invest in education alone, we generate so much money because we'd be exporting skills. For example, if we exported skills, what would happen? We'd have money coming in externally, not shifting internal money. If we, for example, took a technological leap, we'd be creating. We wouldn't be relying on China. Why are we importing? Why are we relying on China? If we, for example, made land accessible to everybody else, everybody in the Republic, over and above color, and people could farm if they wanted to, they could produce if they wanted to, and they could get into business in an easier manner, We generate income. If we say this GDP is great, we treble it. Believe me, we do that. Because I don't think we lack in the intellectual department. I don't think...
So when we hear the slogan then, and as you've unpacked it and explained the ramifications and implications of what you're stating about land belonging to the state, when the same sloganeering is made by political parties like the EFF and now the ANC, which seems to purportedly jump on the bandwagon, what's the meaning that they import to that?
The meaning is that wolves are arguing amongst themselves about the property of the sheep.
So in other words, deployment of land amongst cadres, amongst a certain selected few.
This is an argument between thieves. It's not an argument between the people who should be rightly...
So it's the thieves talking about nationalization of land for themselves.
To plunder. It makes it easier. If they nationalize land, they can plunder it much easier because, one, they can sell off the rights and get kickbacks on it. Two, they can keep the people in poverty because the ANC functions and keeps power because it preys on the poor, promising them a tomorrow, their saviors. The poor not realizing that these are the very same people who are causing their woes, who are now promising them solutions.
Why is there no political awakening?
Political awakening, Yusuf, this is an interesting question because I just wrote something on it and I was saying it's the psychology of the oppressed. Frantz Fanon talks about this. Paulo Freire talks about this. It says that when the oppressed begin to think and measure, they measure themselves and they measure others in the measure of the oppressor. Now our people, if you look at cultural, there's a cultural point here that we tend not to look at. For example, when you look at cultural societies, they tend to place faith in leaders, you know, blind faith. And this is either in chiefs or kings or even the politicians.
And the ability to overcome and overlook shortcomings.
Well, it's a sense of powerlessness. It's a sense of the lack of agency is where we can't change the state of affairs. So let's appoint Yusuf to change it. And then we give Yusuf a blank check. Yusuf plunders and makes us poorer. We still trust Yusuf because he's the savior. Now that savior mentality you'll see in the EFF when they created Malema. Then they created Zuma. For example, it's populist.
Populist support.
And it's demagogic.
Is that what it basically amounts to? The idea of the powerlessness of the poor resulting in the political leadership that we see and the demagoguery that's at large. And Ramaphosa perhaps maybe a manifestation of that?
Well, I still believe that democracy can work. I'm unlike my colleague here, Rassool. I'm a social democrat and not a socialist. So, I mean, the kind of system I want to see in South Africa is more or less a resource-driven economy that will have sufficient resources to support a welfare state and the kind of economy you get in the Scandinavian countries, where you take people out of poverty, you provide them through the resource-driven economy with jobs, and then you look after those like the people who are destitute, and there should be a minimum of those, the elderly, the disabled. But essentially, I believe in democracy and contestation of political parties. I don't believe in a socialist system where you have a completely centralized economy and only one party that dominates. They tried that in Eastern Europe, they tried it in the Soviet Union, it failed.
Probably Stalinism is what we would
that's right.
call that.
But instead, I believe in a social democracy. As I said, the kind of model you get in the Scandinavian countries, to some extent they've had it in the UK, they have it in some...
But not the model of Eastern Europe and Latin
no,
America.
That's different.
I think we're more in agreement than disagreement.
Probably.
We at a stage where society is looking for a new system.
Correct.
The isms are not our solution. They're not isms that are complete solutions in themselves. but rather they're gateways and pathways to
Correct.
creatively engaging what
Most
should be the
certainly.
future. We haven't reached the end of politics.
Most certainly.
We haven't reached the end of
At least the
economics.
zenith of politics.
Yes, there's still
you're
life
right.
after the ANC. There's still life
Most
after
certainly.
this dispensation. And when we look at democracy, we have to look at the systems of democracy, the format of democracy. For example, oligarchy must go. There's no argument. Direct democracy must come in. When we look at economy, it must be a shared economy based on equitable distribution.
You speak about piracy on one level, which is obviously the system itself, but there's another level to it, which is somewhat more extreme when you see clear cases of open criminality. The case in point, the arrest of Zandile Gumede, the mayor in Durban, allegations of clear open theft, not just simply a question of operating within an unequal system, but clear open aspects of criminality, allegations that she had individuals bumped off, murdered and so on. That's also something which the ANC has now come to tolerate.
Well, I was actually going to raise a point earlier about morality, the collective morality of the country. Where is the collective morality that points us in a direction that we need to go? Why don't we care for the people who have been
Correct.
defrauded every day? Why aren't we, for example, looking at the landless? Why aren't we looking at the people in shacks? Why are we focusing on the elites? Why are we focusing on the wolves? Is it a case of power dynamics? You know, we're afraid of which wolf will, eat us in a better way. But they're going to eat us anyway.
What's your, if you had to have a magic ball, what's your predictions for the next 5 years?
For me, I think the system will continue
As the same
with
as before?
with minor changes, unless there is a convulsion in the thinking. There's a radical departure from what we are thinking now, and there's a restructuring of the system.
Are we at the tipping point of a revolution?
Well, it depends on what we conceive a revolution to be. I believe that a revolution is an idea. I believe that a revolution is a new way of doing things. And I think we as society have to now mobilize. We have to begin to think. We have to begin to rethink. We have to begin to think about thinking and see how do we look at the system that is supposedly for us to be at the center, not a system where the wolves are over us and dictating to us.
Way forward, future 5 years.
I want a caring and compassionate society just like Rassool. And I think we need to do a lot of thinking, and that ordinary people have got to get involved. We can't just leave it to the politicians or the experts. They've messed the country up. The secret is involvement from the bottom, that communities have got to be involved. That is absolutely essential. I think the electoral system is entirely wrong, where the political parties decide who goes on the list and ranks them.
That should change.
We've got to get away from that. The ordinary people must have a say, and a direct say, in who goes to Parliament. So certain fundamental changes have to be made, and one of those is the electoral system. Furthermore, people mustn't just sit back and say, we can do nothing.
There needs to be
People
an active movement.
have to get involved at the community level, and they must talk honestly to the politicians, to the governing party, to the opposition party, etc. They've got to talk, and talk frankly. And that is the route to go.
Thank you very much, Professor Devenish, on that positive advice. We'd leave you at that. We hope to have further engagement with you and Rassool Snyman, founder of the anti-treason movement. It's been a pleasure to have both of you. And that's all we have for this evening. You've been watching I Beg to Differ. We've been discussing post-election coverages in South Africa. And join us next week for more interactive debate. Till then, this is Yusuf Ismail signing for and on behalf of ITV. Greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum and good evening.